So I'll be walking you through, as you can see by the title, sort of really around third-party risk and the challenges and drivers we've really seen in the market. So if your attention does waver, you obviously got some nice images around. I was actually at the Etihad, and as a Manchester United fan about a month ago, it's safer surroundings. It feels better here. But yeah, as a starting point, I really just want to go in and focus around really where we've seen sort of the drivers and challenges behind third-party risk, where it's really come, and I suppose the difficulties we've seen organisations facing. So I suppose there's three main areas. When you think about regulations in the market, GDPR is obviously a very prevalent one, especially within Europe. But you think about how these rules and regulations are continuing to evolve globally. CCPA was obviously one that's just been launched as well. Brazilian law, the Indian. So all of these regulations are going to continue to evolve and adapt. And I think it's really where it's forced organisations to really approach third-party risk in a different way. Because while organisations may have been looking at it and sort of managing it sort of in-house, there's never really been anything that's really put it at the forefront and saying, well, you do actually need to ensure the third parties and sub-processes are actually appropriate to do work with. And when you think about sort of data breaches globally, you're always sort of hearing it in the news sort of regularly. As these continue to happen, it's putting more and more prominence and more focus on, well, what are you doing with that data that you're holding? Are you managing that securely? And that goes for those third parties that you're working with. An interesting fact, I think I've seen it on the flyer for the day. I think it's 80% of all data breaches happen with your third parties. And that's through a Gartner study. So it really does sort of put into focus, while you can protect your four walls and everything that's going on within there, ultimately it's those third parties that you're working with, which is a huge risk, something that really needs to be focused on. So that's really where we're sort of seeing that shift. And from an individual's level, I think in today's day and age, you've never been more sort of aware of the rights from what you expect your organisations to be doing with your data. And I think you see a lot of organisations actually leveraging that almost like a marketing tool. So Apple, especially, we talk about privacy, that's a big element, that's a big selling point. Because on an individual level, you know and you have certain expectations. Sorry, I feel like I'm wandering all over. You have certain expectations of what you want an organisation to do. And another one, the phone company 3, when they had a breach a year or two ago, whenever it was, not only do you have that sort of pressure from regulators from that perspective, but they lost almost 300,000 customers. So you think about that cost, not only from what they're losing on a monthly basis, but to try and get back to that point, the amount of investment they have to do to try and get their reputation back, to bring them back on board, is going to take a lot of time and a lot of investment. So that's really where it's sort of forcing organisations to say, well, okay, if we lose data, ultimately this can really have an impact on our bottom line. So that's, I suppose, the three areas we're really seeing around what's driving the need. But there's obviously difficulties around that, because the amount of information that's being created on a daily basis, whether it's on an individual level or by an organisation, is continuing to sort of ramp up. So that gives more difficulties for an organisation. How are you managing that data? So whether it's different business units within your organisation, leveraging new tools, sort of machine learning or AI and all these sort of buzzwords, because you can really manage this data and get a lot from it. So you can, as an organisation, really work in a more agile way and really get more value out of this data. But as you're expanding and all these different business units are using more and more third-party vendors, ultimately that's more sources of information where that data is flowing outside of the organisation. And as these sort of data streams and these third parties continue to evolve and we're adding more and more as an organisation, how are we actually managing that relationship? So when you're doing this on a small level, you can have that sort of one-to-one relationship with when you go through the contract stage, you've got that good relationship, so should any privacy or security processes change, you can sort of communicate that quite easily. But when you're doing this at scale, are you fully aware of all of those relationships and how they're being managed? If your structure internally changes, if their structure changes or people move roles, who's that single point of contact that you can go to and get that information from? So that becomes more and more of a challenge. And that's from the external point of view, but internally as well. It'd be interesting to know, sort of everyone in here, if you had to go out and procure a new IT system, would you really know that process? Would you know the individual you'd have to reach out to? I'd say the majority, especially in the wider organisation, wouldn't. They'd probably know the loopholes and the ways to get around it and sort of bring these systems in without making maybe the procurement or the security team aware. So again, managing those relationships and those points within the organisation becomes more of a challenge. And then as we increase on this, how do we then continue to monitor all of these vendor relationships on an ongoing basis? So while they might be appropriate to do work with, their security, their privacy policies are all to our standard when we sign that contract and we bring them on board. What happens if things change in the next 2 years? What if their sub-processes get updated? Are you being made aware of that? Are you going out and do your reassessments of these vendors that you're working with to ensure that they're still appropriate to work with? Because ultimately, it's your responsibility to ensure that's the case. So when we're doing this at scale, and we spoke about having more and more relationships with more and more vendors, being able to monitor them, if you're doing that in a manual process, is almost impossible. So again, these are big challenges that organisations are facing. So whether it's sort of from an information overload, too many vendors to sort of manage, you've got that disconnect between the vendors themselves, or you just can't manage it on an ongoing basis, so you don't have that real oversight over all your third parties that you're working with. They're all challenges. But we're managing it in some way today. This might ring a few bells. A few fancy spreadsheets throughout the organisation. Maybe one department's got their list, another department's got theirs. And while Excel's a fantastic tool, it can do a lot. When we're talking about doing things at scale and leveraging automation, like we've sort of mentioned, it has massive drawbacks and limitations. An interesting one, there was a bank my colleague was working with in Spain, and we were looking at their sort of central list of vendors that they're managing, and it was through a nice big fancy spreadsheet, and we were just going to import it into the system. We sort of sat down, went through it, but he couldn't understand it. He was Spanish, so he did actually understand the language, but he didn't really know what that information was. And what had happened, they brought in an outside consultant to collate all of their different spreadsheets, bring it into one central point, and that project team then passed it over, and that's where that disconnect happened. And then from an organisation point of view, you don't know all of the vendors you're working with, you don't know the risks associated with them. If you needed to run a report on that, you couldn't. So if the regulators or the auditors come, again, it's a huge risk for you as an organisation. So we've seen a real shift away from that sort of traditional method in Excel, that manual process, towards software solutions. And there's 3 pillars and the advantages that we're seeing leveraged. So from the assessment side, leveraging automation from this point of view. So traditional ways of creating that Excel spreadsheet of questions and then emailing it back, and that back and forth of reviewing. By creating these assessments and building your own or leveraging industry standards, where you can actually build in that logic to say once a question's answered a certain way, that may trigger a certain risk that can automatically be flagged, and the workflows beyond that. So that's really where assessments can be really enhanced when you're leveraging a software tool. And we're seeing a lot of organisations now working almost more of a collaborative manner, so leveraging an exchange sort of area. So if you think about these vendors, they're being asked 101 different times, 101 different ways for the same information. So your security, your ISO, your standards, whatever they've got, you need. but ultimately they're having to go through that process every single time. But by leveraging these sort of exchanges, it's an area where you as an organisation can almost do your due diligence and say, okay, we understand that they've got these certifications, we understand the privacy and security policy, so you can almost say whether they're appropriate to work with before you go through that assessment phase. And then finally, from the monitoring perspective, so once you've got that vendor list that you're working with, it shouldn't be a case of having to, oh, I've got to resend out these assessments, or setting a reminder in your calendar to send out the reassessments to maybe your high-risk vendors just in case. Why can't we build in that automation to actually trigger these assessments to go out again? So should anything change, you can be made aware rather than going through that manual process each and every time, if you remember. And further on from that, it's really broken down, and we've seen it sort of broken down into a life cycle. So 6 main stages. So from the moment a new vendor's been identified as someone you want to potentially work with, again, this can be difficult. We spoke about, well, who's that point of contact? What's that process we need to follow? Going through that exchange data, going through the assessment and review stage, understanding what risks are associated with that, mitigating and putting controls in place for that. Ultimately then reporting to the business, showing, okay, well, this is what we've done. These are the high-risk vendors that we're working with. These are the controls that we have in place. And again, if you're doing that on an Excel spreadsheet, unless you're sort of a whiz, it can be very difficult. But then finally, sort of business as usual, monitoring those vendors on an ongoing basis. So what I'll do, I'll walk through these sort of 6 stages and really where we've seen sort of the market shift, because ultimately from the identification stage, the goal is to move away from that spreadsheet, get it into one central inventory within that software. So what we can do, we can leverage a self-service portal. So actually give the ability to the different business units to flag, this is the type of vendor I want to work with, this is the information it's going to hold. And again, that automation can actually trigger maybe a certain other assessment, information that you need to go, actions that need to be triggered. Leveraging integration, so whether there's procurement, ITRSM systems that you're using now, should any of these be updated, it's ultimately about feeding into that central repository. So we've always got that evergreen data set of these vendors that we're working with as an organisation. Or ultimately just bulk importing them, because we just need that central repository rather than these silos of information. And again, from the exchange data, I sort of touched on this, but this is really about that due diligence. So rather than going through that whole assessment phase, chasing them for security profiles and certifications that you may not necessarily need because they might not be appropriate to work with in the first place, by leveraging this sort of aggregated research, ultimately it allows you to understand more about these organisations, and it gives the vendors themselves the ability to say, look, this is what we have. If you want to approach us and work with us, we can do it. So from both sides, it saves a lot of time and a lot of effort. Having security and privacy updates always available within here. So again, rather than having to go out and find this, updating this central exchange where people can access this at all times. And now the assessment stage, and again, we spoke about this, whether you're leveraging an Excel spreadsheet or another tool that you've got sort of in-house at the moment, ultimately the goal is to automate this. Because we shouldn't have to get the responses, read through them, check on another spreadsheet, check what risks that means, what tasks, what controls need to be put in place from that. Leverage these workflows. So again, starting from maybe the identification stage, what type of data is it going to hold? Can we build in a workflow to say, okay, well, that may mean we need to ask this set of questions or this set of questions, rather than just having a rigid questionnaire that we send out to absolutely everyone. Can we create the risk profile off the back of that? So again, we understand what questions we're asking. We understand what risks will be associated with that if they answer a certain way. So again, by pre-building this in, it just allows us to have that sort of workflow and that time saving off the back of it. Or even leveraging managed services, so getting a third party to actually go out and do this chasing for us. So a lot of the time, the difficulty can actually just getting the response back. So it's a very manual, time-intensive process. And again, once those assessments have been completed, we understand those risks. We then need to understand what mitigation, what controls need to be put in place. Because once we've got this structure, we can really understand, okay, well, it's a particular type of risk. We understand those risk ratings, the treatment plans, everything that can be put in place. Again, leveraging those workflows, that automation off the back of this. So that whole process from the identification, the assessment, mitigation can all be, that workflow can be triggered without having that manual intervention in the first place. And then from a reporting perspective, ultimately we've got this evergreen data set, so we've always got that up to date and available for us. So we're always available to feed that back into the organisation. But when we think about from a contract perspective, we've got this central log. So again, we're talking about the Excel spreadsheets. We understand the risks associated with them. Why can't we then actually understand what's within the contract off the back of that? So any SLAs, any performance reviews associated with this. Because once we understand this, we can then run reports on it and actually run performance, and we can see how we've actually performed over the year, over the life of that contract. And again, from an auditing and regulator perspective, at all times, this central inventory allows us to be fully aware, fully updated of all the risks, all the vendors that we have within an organisation. And obviously, off the back of that, we can have those dashboards, the sort of visual reporting that we can feed through the business that makes it easier to digest, rather, again, those long, sort of meaty spreadsheets. And then finally, that monitoring, so the business as usual now. Again, by leveraging this automation, feeding into this central inventory, we can fully understand all of those fourth parties that our sub-processors and our vendors are working with at all times, whether that is through that exchange, whether that is through sort of the chasing services we have with our third parties. But ultimately, again, it's just always feeding in. So from a reporting perspective, this is always that evergreen data set for us. So that's really how we've seen sort of organisations break it down and sort of evolve into this. Now, as an organisation, as I mentioned, I'm with the Vendorpedia team. This is something that we've developed, and this 6 stages is really where organisations have sort of fed that back to us. And it is something we have within our platform. So right the way from the assessment stage, leveraging exchange, where we've actually got over 8,000 vendors that our in-house team have pre-assessed. So we've got that security, the privacy policies, we've got their certifications. So it's simply a case of accessing that and then pulling that into your central inventory. And if there's someone in there or someone isn't in there, you can actually ask us and we'll go out and chase them for you. That's part of that chasing service. So all of these different areas, there's obviously a lot to this, but as a platform, it's part of a wider tool. You may know us, OneTrust, from our privacy background, so really around those regulations like GDPR, that's really where it's grown out, as well as incident breach, and it's really part of a wider GRC platform. But we do have a booth, we're sort of through the doors and on the right-hand side. So yeah, if there's any sort of questions on that, or if you want to go into a bit more in depth, happy to go through that upstairs. Yeah, really appreciate taking the time and happy to take any questions. Perfect. Thank you.